Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Washington, and welcome to this edition of the Bill Black Report. Now joining us is Bill Black. Bill is an associate professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He's also a white-collar criminologist and former financial regulator and author of the book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And of course, he's a regular contributor to the Real News. Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Thank you.
So, Bill, a lot of news coming out of the IMF this week. What have you been tracking exactly?
Okay, so here's the 30-second background. IMF stands for International Monetary Fund. It's an international group that is supposed to assist countries that are suffering an acute financial crisis, as opposed to the World Bank, which is supposed to help folks more generally in development. And by tradition, the World Bank is run by an American and the IMF is run by a European. In this case, by a series of French politicians, currently Madame Lagarde, and it's the IMF and she have gotten into a series of major embarrassments recently. First, she is being charged with a crime while she sits as head of the IMF. And this crime is under French law from her role earlier as a minister in the French government, where there was a suit emerging against a bank. And that bank got into enough economic trouble that it was bailed out by the French government, became a public bank. And Lagarde allowed claimants against this bank, who were political allies of her and her party, to sue the French government, not in court with the normal defenses you would have, but through an arbitration system where, unsurprisingly, the French lost big time. This is ultimately reversed by a court, but this is seen as a scandal in which she attempted to bail out a major creditor by intervening to help them take an action that she should have been moving exactly the opposite direction to protect French funds. So it's a weird crime from a U.S. perspective in that the charge is negligence as opposed to deliberate crime, but it's still obviously a major embarrassment. Second big thing, the IMF has long been criticized, including by a Nobel Prize winner in economics, as being staffed, and I quote, by third-rate economists, and has been traditionally, while supposedly helping nations in economic crisis, it has been a very neoliberal hammer that says, hey, actually, we're going to force your head of state out of office. And hey, we don't like a whole bunch of policies that you have, which we think are not good for other European nations and such. And so you are going to change all those policies. And you're
like
going to,
what they did in Greece.
Like what they did in Greece, but even worse in in literally 60, 70 different nations. And this is very tied in with the Washington Consensus as well, pushing all these nations towards very right-wing policies. Anyway, so IMF, with all those problems, has at least had a standing doctrine that says you can't hammer the government in this way without giving it and force it into a position where it is in a long-run debt trap where it can't get out, because that's just stupid, right? And so when it came to Greece and the European Union wanted the IMF involved in the supposed bailout of the Greeks, which is really a bailout of mostly German, but not exclusively German banks, they had to ignore this requirement of the IMF because Of course, that's exactly what they were forcing the Greeks into, and all of the economic work by IMF economists showed that. Now, on top of that, the IMF forever has been this big believer in austerity, but IMF economists have started to publish that austerity is an incredibly stupid response to an economic crisis.
But aren't they third-rate economists, Bill? Like you were saying.
Well, no, these are the new economists hired in part because of the embarrassment of the really bad pro-austerity economics that didn't work, right? Okay. And so the economics profession, parts of it actually have been changing for the better. IMF has some of that flavor. And if you simply do straight work in economics, of course, you would have found, as they did, that not only did austerity fail, but that stimulus worked really well. So IMF has started publishing papers that say not only did stimulus work, stimulus was more effective than its proponents said it would be, right? So, and coming from the IMF, this is pretty amazing stuff. So all of that had to get ignored in Greece. Forcing Greece into a debt trap had to be ignored. They couldn't go to their board, which they're supposed to, with their plan on Greece because they would have had to explain they were violating their own rules. So they didn't even go to their board. And so the equivalent of an internal auditor at the IMF has released a report scorching the IMF leadership, which of course is run by the same person who is being prosecuted as a criminal by the French and is running one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. And on top of all that, to bring it back to the United States, Hillary Clinton has said recently, oh, no, we can't have those kind of stimulus programs because, and I will paraphrase and almost directly quote her, that's what produced Germany in the 1920s and Zimbabwe in the 1990s. In other words, hyperinflation. So Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee for the president, is now far to the right, in the loony right, of the IMF and where its third-rate economists used to be. So now we have the insanity that Hillary Clinton is far, far, far to the right of the most historically right-wing loony economists, the third-rate economists at the IMF. So that must make her consulting fifth-rate economists.
Yeah, and all of these policies, though, have real effects on everyday people. So it's a bit troubling, Bill.
It is, and so as we're talking, very good job numbers have come out today. But it is true that the recovery from the Great Recession compared to other recoveries has been relatively weak. All right? In fact, the weakest. And of course, the answer to that is yes, because in other recoveries, we used far more stimulus and we were far more successful. And the Republicans blocked that stimulus. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the Republicans, because, of course, it was famously the revolt of the Blue Dog Democrats, the conservative Democrats, that caused the stimulus bill to be dramatically reduced. But it was also President Obama who infamously said in a State of the Union address, you know, in a recession, everybody has to tighten their belt, and so must government. Now, that's 12th-rate economist stuff, which he knew to be a lie. And so it was just a pure political statement. But that's what's weak in the recovery. And the Democrats ought to be able to say in the election, what are you talking about? Of course it's a weaker recovery. It's because you clowns were blocking us. Unfortunately, there's a lot of dirty laundry on the Democratic side as well.
All right, Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.